Hello and welcome to another update. In this one, the Ukrainian probing attacks continue as they attempt to gain their initial breakthrough to allow their upcoming summer offensive. So what we're seeing so far is that the Ukrainian forces continue their attacks, especially here in the south of the front line, where they continue their attacks west of Velika Novosilka, west of Uledar, and now they have also started attacking south of Orikhiv, in the same directions the Russian forces attacked in a few months prior to the spring. So we see the Ukrainian forces are attacking the village of Lubkove as well as the village of Nesteryanka, south of Novodanilivka and east of Novodanilivka. And here we have seen some very interesting developments. First of all, according to the Russian Ministry of Defense, this attack was conducted by the 47th Mechanized Brigade of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, and it included 1,500 soldiers and 150 armored vehicles. So when it comes to losses, I don't usually quote the Russian Ministry of Defense or the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. However, when it comes to troop sizes, then it makes sense in general to look at those sources, as they wouldn't lie with how many troops they are attacking with. And we have seen a lot of videos suggesting that this is within an acceptable scope or within an acceptable spectrum of how many units is being used for these probing attacks. But the most interesting part is that there is allegedly Leopard tanks involved in the fighting here to the southeast of Novodanilivka, and I had taken it upon myself to take a look at those pictures to make sure that they are actually Leopard tanks, because we have seen previous photos and videos claiming that there were Leopard tanks involved. However, we had not confirmed it, and Redeffect made a video where he disproved one of those pictures / videos, where he realized it was an AMX-10 tank and not a Leopard 2 tank. However, if we take a look at the tanks used in this one, we can see here in this picture right here, we can see, if we zoom in a lot, that this is most likely a Leopard tank and not a AMX-10. First of all, the AMX-10 is fairly small. It is about 5 meters long and 2.5 meters wide, while the Leopard tanks is about 7.5 meters long and 3.5 meters wide. And comparing these tanks to the M113A2s, which are similar in size to the AMX-10, we can see that the Leopard tanks here are shown to be much larger than the M113 tanks or M113 armored personnel carriers, indicating that these are indeed Leopard tanks. Something very interesting to take into note and account as well is that the AMX-10 is wheeled. It has about 3 to 4 wheels on each side, and the Leopard tanks is tracked, and it is very difficult to see because there's a lack of pixels, but it looks as if this is tracked and not wheeled. So on top of the different factors, we can most likely determine that these are Leopard tanks and these are not AMX-10 tanks. And then if we move further on, we see that they suffered a lot of losses. We see again what looks like a Leopard tank. This is one of the two. And we see the M113s here to the northwest of this area. So we see that these tanks were indeed in combat in this part of the front line. Whether or not they were destroyed, that is another question. There is this specific picture right here which shows a few of them disabled. So it is unclear if it was disabled, destroyed, or just abandoned, or if they managed to return. There's no evidence or confirmation of any of those. However, it is indeed seen for them to be in combat here in the Zaporizhzhia front. So what does this actually mean? This means that the main thrust of the Ukrainian offensive is closing in. So what have we seen so far? We have seen probing attacks on the whole southern front, as well as in the south and the north of the Bakhmut front, where the Ukrainians have finally managed to increase the gray zone a little bit, but that's about all they have achieved so far. And in the southern parts, we have seen them advance within the prior gray zones and reach the village of Novodonetsk, which they captured, but then they were pushed back. So what does this mean? This means that they are being held back, not at the first line of defense, but at the Russian forward positions in front of the lines of defense. If we take a look at this map was created by a Finnish journalist, and we can see that here we have the front lines as well as the gray zones. So the Ukrainian forces are advancing within this front line. But most importantly, we see that the first line of defense of the Russian forces is way deeper compared to where the fighting is actually taking place. The fighting is taking place where Russian artillery is shooting at the advancing Ukrainians. They are also taking their shots at the Ukrainian positions with their air force and anti-tank gun missiles. But most of the forces actually fighting are just Russian forward positions, not their actual defensive lines. If the Ukrainians are to meet the Russian defensive line, they have to advance much deeper before they're able to fight them. So this means that what the Ukrainians currently are fighting is the weakest parts of the defensive positions of the Russian forces. When they go deeper and fight the actual defensive lines, then they will have to go through a lot more to actually advance. And even at these frontal defenses, forward positions, the Ukrainians are being unable to advance. They are not able to push beyond the Russian defenses and forward positions, which indicates that the Russians have heavily prepared for this offensive, and they are completely prepared to hold back the offensive, preventing the Ukrainians from achieving success. If we look at the Zaporizhzhia front itself, we see a lot of different lines of defense. Around Tokmak, there's a whole circle, and in these positions, there are multiple lines, and the Ukrainian forces have to push through all of these to be able to succeed. So far, they are fighting at the very first positions, south of Novodanilivka, northwest of Novopokrovka, and they have achieved minor success here in the southwest, and this is the area where the alleged Leopard tanks were seen. We see here Novodanilivka and Novopokrovka, and the Russian forces have managed to prevent these forces from advancing further. So even at the very first lines of contact, the Ukrainian forces are suffering heavy losses to try and break through the initial fighting. So far it seems that the Ukrainians are having a very hard time to achieve any form of success with these probing attacks, which are smaller in scale, but they are still very significant as they are attacking in multiple directions. So allegedly the Ukrainians have prepared about 9 brigades of Western equipment, and we're seeing the first ones being thrown in to do these probing attacks. If they continue at this rate, then their offensive power will continue to diminish, which will prevent the strength of the actual spearheads, which will decrease the strength of the actual spearhead once they break through these initial positions and manage to reach the first lines of defense of the Russian defensive forces. So far we have seen very limited Ukrainian success across the front line as the Russian forces are continuously attacking these forward positions and probing attacks with air strikes as well as artillery strikes, heavily diminishing their offensive power as they try to advance, while the Ukrainian forces are just attempting to get by and break through the first lines of defenses in the forward positions. So it seems that the Ukrainians have to significantly increase their offensive power and try to actually attack with serious forces rather than continuing their probing attacks, because it is clear that their probing attacks are bringing nothing but losses. So what exactly are probing attacks? Probing attacks are attacks that are formed to identify the strengths and weaknesses of the defensive forces. However, they themselves are not only for that, they are also to, after they identify the weaker positions of the defensive forces, they are also tasked with breaking through the initial lines so that they're able to establish a proper situation for the spearhead to actually break through. So the first part of an offensive is always to shape the battlefield so that the spearhead itself achieves the maximum amount of success possible. So if the Russian forces are looking to prevent the Ukrainian offensive, then they must prevent the probing attacks from achieving any significant breakthroughs, which will allow for a spearhead to break through the Russian defensive positions. And that is what we're seeing so far. The Russian forces are completely withholding any of the probing attacks preventing them from achieving success and advancing beyond the first lines of contact in the front line. And that is all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.